Chido. We will be recording this. So if you have any questions, you have any comments, please go ahead and type those in the chat function. And then Ms. Diane Chido will present her remarks. And then we'll fill in any questions that you have and go for the discussion from there. Doug?
Hey, good morning, afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. Very excited that you've chosen to spend a little bit of your day with us. Also very excited for the discussion. Local governance and providing good governance is a key to third order effects mission. So excited to hear the discussion from Diane. Diane Chido is a founder of DC Analytics and has over 25 years of experience in supporting post-conflict and fragile societies. She has published and lectured widely on security, intelligence, socio-cultural, and economic development topics, and possesses MS in applied intelligence analysis and an MA in Russian language. As a security intelligence policy advisor for the Army's Peacekeeping and Stability Institute, PKSOI, Diane conducted research and doctrine and policy reviews on stability-related topics such as legitimacy and alternative governance, dense urban environments, the relationship between transnational organized crime and conflict, United Nations intelligent policy development, and information sharing in multinational environments. So with that impressive introduction and bio, Diane, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Doug. That just means I know a little bit about a lot of things. So let me go ahead and share my screen. I do have slides here. Oops, that's the wrong screen. Love when that happens. I've been doing this in class for weeks. I don't know why it's not cooperating today. Okay, are you seeing my slides? Or my desktop?
Yes.
The slides? Okay, very good. All right, great. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for taking time out of your day to discuss approaches to local governance. We got some questions in advance from some folks at Civil Affairs, and I hope that we will touch on the answers. They were very, very good questions. So I just got finished teaching a course on elective on alternative governance structures, which is a particular area of interest of mine, because I feel, as Dr. Foley, who spoke last week, we have a poor understanding of the places where we tend to operate. And Civil Affairs has immense skill in this area, but hasn't quite identified what is its pizza, what is its thing, what does it contribute? And I've been working with Civil Affairs for a couple of years on this problem as well. So I do appreciate these questions and this interest. Alternative governance, in my mind, is something that doesn't look like what we consider governance. My students did case studies on things from Boko Haram to the Amish living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to a group of Mennonites that have been in Kyrgyzstan for 500 years, to some prison gangs, to identify what sorts of things that we would tend to want to mitigate in a conflict or even a humanitarian assistance environment that may actually be our best friends in that environment because we failed to understand their value. So let's look a little bit at this and, okay, so already I have missed my slide. I have to be patient. So when we think about the US military, we think about what does it do? What do we call our soldiers? We call them warfighters. We warfight. We are even now preparing for near-peer competition with Russia and China because that's what we do is we fight wars. Well, I'm afraid I'm here to tell you that that's not entirely true. This is a chart we put together when I was at the Army's Peacekeeping Institute, where we looked back to 1898, and we could probably go further back and find the same trend. What you see on this chart that's in blue, excuse me, in red, is actual combat periods. So if you look at the familiar period of 1941, Japan, Italy, Austria, Germany, we see here that we were actually at war for 4 years. The rest of all of this period, obviously, that we're all familiar with, is stabilization operations, essentially, which can include humanitarian operations, or just cleaning up after war. 85% of what our military has been tasked to do is not war over the course of our history. This is so true that we have so many dozens of words for what that means because we say we don't do nation building. We don't do any of these things. Therefore, we keep changing the name for it and pretending that we're inventing something new. So irregular warfare, counterinsurgency. Some of my favorites are highlighted here, like War of the Flea. Today, gray zones is pretty popular. And of course, the ever popular MUTWA, military operations other than war. So these are things that we've done over and over and over again, but we fail to resource for them and we fail to plan for them. Yet it's essentially what we do. So around 2007, when things were particularly rough in Iraq, the PKSOI, the Army's Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, and the United States Institute of Peace got together and said, okay, we say we don't do this stuff, but we are doing it. We're doing it right now. How do we learn from our past and figure out how to do it better? So they came up with the guiding principles for stabilization and reconstruction. It's sort of a Bible for those of us who do this sort of work, or at least think about it. And this graphic encapsulates the 250-page book that they came up with, where they took doctrine from across the Joint Force, across history, across the world, from NATO, from UN, from various countries, and looked at the elements that go into what we call post-conflict stabilization. And as you can see from the graphic, we have to, of course, ensure there's a safe and secure environment, or we can't do anything else. Although, as Emma Skye has said in her book Unraveling about Iraq, as soon as people feel safe, to the degree that David Kilcullen says they have predictability in their lives, they can go to the market, they can send their kids to school, they start clamoring for jobs and everything else, and then they think you stink. So watch out once you provide security. Then we have to establish rule of law, social well-being, which can mean anything from infrastructure rebuilding to make sure society can function, to knitting communities back together, sustainable economy, making sure people have jobs, they can feed their families, and stable governance, which is what we're here to speak about today. There's also these cross-cutting principles in the center that are sort of the gray matter, the brains of all of this sort of daisy of stability operations. And one of the critical aspects here is political primacy, remembering that everything comes down to power, who wields it, who benefits from it, and who's outside of it. This relates to legitimacy and unity of effort. So these are very important parts of governance, which essentially we describe as providing essential services, taking care of the state resources and making sure they're equitably distributed, political moderation and accountability, so there isn't too much power focused in one area, and civic participation and empowerment, so that people are encouraged to be part of this power sharing agreement that we call politics. The military approach to this calls these end states. So we are trying to get to the state of stable governance. And each of these items underneath here are the conditions that lead to that. If you read the whole book, as I have, and turn all of the elements into an Excel spreadsheet, which is what I do with everything, including Christmas lists, underneath each of these conditions are about a half a dozen approaches. So the way that you go forward in trying to achieve these conditions to get to the end state of stable governance. One of the questions that came up before this is basically, we know we have to do all of these things. Do we have to do them one after another, or do we do them all at once? The good news is we do need them all. The bad news is, yes, we need to do them all at once. So it makes it difficult to have a checklist and prioritization once we have a minimum level of security. So we have all seen the Competition Continuum, which is the Joint Forces' new conceptual model of conflict and peace, where we say we have cooperation, which is basically used to be called peace. We have competition that's just below this red level of armed conflict. And that is the sweet spot of basically what happens in stabilization. You start developing cooperation among all the parties, and you're having some competition, but it's not terribly violent. And this is the place where we're talking about. So stable governance. We've looked at these elements, and we understand that it's one piece of all that has to be done at the local and federal level, obviously, and in between. So I've come up with some thinking about this. And if any of you know Lieutenant Colonel Joe Long, I shamelessly stole this conceptual model from his Liberator's Dilemma, but with his consent. This is what I call the stabilization trap. So the population is really the target, right? We talk about population-centric approaches, about the hearts and minds, about making sure the population is safe and secure, about figuring out what they need. The population is our target. And we, as the stabilizer, we have a particular basket of goods and services that we offer them. Everything from security to jobs, to everything in between, healthcare, education. But what I call the alternative governance structure, which is basically the spoilers or even a decent, legitimate force that we may see as our competitor in this environment, is offering an alternative way, an alternative governance structure. They also have goods and services that they're offering. So when we look at the population here, we recognize that for the stabilizer, we have these goods and services to offer and say, come do these things our way. But at the same time, we have a cost. We have a cost in resources. We have a cost in public will to continue. Remember our chart that showed how we were in combat for 4 years in Germany and Japan, but we have remained there for 75 years assisting with this stabilization. Well, that cost increases over time, whereas for the alternative governance structure, they have their goods and services they're offering or their governance methodology, but they also have, in addition to that, they have the locational, linguistic, and cultural alignment. So they understand the population better than we can. They have the language. They are not leaving. This is their location where they plan on setting up camp for good. So they don't have this as time goes along and we're losing resources and popular will. So we have almost no chance of success when we look at it this way, unless we take away the advantage of the L, the locational, linguistic, and cultural alignment, and we be sure that we understand the populations that we're trying to work with more effectively before we decide what they need and we try to engage with them. We look at governance as a sort of hierarchy, and we see those end states here that we talked about. The hope is stable governance. It doesn't say anything about good governance in the principles. But we have stable governance is what we start with. These conditions, as Kilcullen said, start with predictability, right? We want people to feel like things are getting to be normal. They can function normally. They're not in fear of their lives anymore. And now it's time to only go up from there. And in that way, we want to establish legitimacy and trust. So the state is, the government is now no longer just stable, it is legitimate. And we have not just predictability, but trust from the people that they can and rely on this form of governance. The state of good governance brings us the condition of reciprocity, where not only are we providing, or the government itself is providing the goods and services that are needed, but the people are engaged. They have ownership over the process. They feel encouraged to be part of it, and they are civically active. This moves governance from being transactional to being relational. And what does this take? It takes a lot of time and other resources in order to be sustainable. And that level of sustainability is variable. You can take many steps forward and a few steps back, or many steps back. This is a constantly evolving dynamic area. And we often go into these situations completely unprepared. And part of the reason for that is the way that we're structured. So this is what I call the legitimacy continuum. We organize ourselves, particularly in the military, as those guys who go in and get things done. And then we move on to the next thing. So we look at stability as a series of tasks. To us, it's transactional. We go in, we take care of it, we come back, we get out, that's it. It's short term, mission accomplished. And we establish this through our competence. Our counterparts know that we're competent. They know that we're able to get the job done. They accept our assistance because they know they can rely on our ability. But in fact, stabilization is a process. It's very long-term, as we saw from the initial chart. It is relational. It's not transactional. This is one of the biggest errors that we make. And in fact, our new approach to Africa, announced by John Bolton about 3 years ago, specifically says that our approach to Africa is going to be transactional. We will help you only if we get this out of it. That's fine, but it's not a measure for success. Stabilization process means connectedness, means real alliance. And unfortunately, we need to have a change of mindset about governance from tasking to process. I was fortunate to know Mr. Hal Saunders, Dr. Hal Saunders, who was one of the primary architects of the Camp David Peace Accord. He was the one who coined the term peace process. And we have to understand that stabilization, developing local governance, and all the other parts that go with it is also a process. It's not just something we can go in and just do. So with that, I will leap off my proverbial soapbox and invite questions, comments.
Diane, I think I have control on the chat box of questions, but I'll start with a question of my own. One, great overview and discussion, as governance is, and military governance is something that's near and dear to our hearts, and the lack of it is frustrating. I want to know what happens when a government appears to be legitimate. They start earning the trust of the people, and then the bad guys come in, take over, and then they kick the bad guys out, and the government comes back in. I would assume it takes longer each iteration for the people to come back and trust the government that second and third time. Have you looked at that?
I would say you're correct, particularly because we continue to insist on labeling what we call spoilers bad guys. That too is a failure to understand what they're after. I look at, for instance, the example of IS in the Islamic Maghreb, right? And AQ in the Islamic Maghreb. You have a series of local grievances, and you have folks that say, okay, I'm fed up with my government because they're doing X to me, and I'm frustrated, and I want things to be different. So they say, okay, fine, we're going to fight against the government. But you have something like AQ or IS that comes along and says, we're a global movement. You join us and you will be so powerful. Well, they're not even necessarily carrying the membership card. All they have to do is put the shingle out and say, we're part of this global movement. And then suddenly they have an easier time recruiting people because they feel like they're part of something larger. They have potentially access to training and resources from these groups. But at the same time, they're really focused on what is their regional, their local grievance. And they can wave the flag for this other stuff just because it helps them deal with that problem. And then we come down with them with the hammer of terrorism. And we think that there is this cancer that's spreading around the world because we fail to understand what's happening locally. So yes, the problem is just thinking about bad guys really trips us up in being able to understand the situation at all and mitigate it properly. So I would say, yes, it does make it more difficult for the population over time because the grievances are still not addressed and they may begin to adhere to them as well when we just keep saying it's this segment of the population that we have to destroy without actually understanding what's going on. Does that answer your question?
No, it's very complicated, I understand, but it's a good rundown on that. And it ties in nicely with our webinar next week. We'll look at another book of understanding cultures and not going in with your own preconceived mindsets and everything. Question that's popped up here. Why is there resource distribution chaos in Africa?
Wow. Well, first, I'm not an economist. Second, I've been looking a lot more lately, personally, about at colonialism. And one of my favorite authors, Richard Dowden, who writes extensively on Africa, he basically talks about how the colonial powers came long enough to destroy what was there before, but typically didn't stay long enough to build something new. So I think that we have, I've written before that I think maybe Gaddafi had something right when he tried to develop the United States of Africa. Of course, he wanted to be the head of it, so that would have been problematic for us. But if you had more, less fear of, let's see, the Organization for African States was originally meant to protect the sovereignty of these newly created states whose borders didn't make any sense. When we got to the African Union, it was meant to be able to assist cross-border when there were things like genocide going on, so that we didn't have this strong adherence to sovereignty. If you could turn Africa into more, if you look at the regional economic groups, you find ECOWAS, for instance, SADC, they tend to have more legitimacy than the individual states that comprise them in some cases. So if you start seeing regional cooperation where you can maybe build interstate highways, you can start building and developing resource management strategies that don't end at the border, like they're starting to do in West Africa for transnational organized crime, where they're working together, I think you would find a lot more opportunity to enhance resource distribution more effectively if there was more of that coordination. And so that's just a potential a personal theory of mine. Again, I'm not an economist.
Do you have any examples of what you would consider successes by the U.S. in approach to stabilization process or improved local governance?
Well, I have a new book coming out about post-Civil War Reconstruction, and that is not one because we only worked on it for 12 years, right? But we look at, of course, we look at our favorite trope. We look at World War II. That's what war is supposed to be, right? That's what it's supposed to look like. Well, it hasn't since then, but we did prepare our approach to what came after long before the war ended, just like Lincoln tried to do in Reconstruction. He started preparing for the end of the war in 1863. We set up the School of Military Governance, and we did all of this planning long before, so that we could actually, manage it well. And we made the commitment to stay for all these years. And that seems to be this measure for success, but it's not the way that we've proceeded since.
I have a question here from General Stockel. In June of 2018, the SAR formally defines agency roles for stabilization missions, with state as the overall lead agency for stabilization efforts, USAID as a lead for implementing agency for non-security stabilization assistance, and DoD as a supporting element. Has DoD outsourced its responsibility, and do you feel aid and DOS have the required resources?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I have to say that my good friend Colonel Anderson was sitting right next to me, penning our portion of the SAR, so I'm very, very familiar with this. So the SAR lays out how to do stabilization effectively, and I think, like the guiding principles, actually provides a really valuable blueprint. The problem is, and I took this slide out of, I had a picture of the SAR actually in this slide deck originally, but I didn't think we would, I thought that was too far in the weeds. I didn't want to drag you there, so I'm very happy to go there. The next slide shows the US federal budget, and that tells the story. Yes, state should be the lead on this. When state has been the lead on things like containment, right? It worked. We used all of our powers, all of our instruments of power, not just the military. But unfortunately, when you look at the federal government budget, you see how the defense budget so enormously dwarfs states' resources that there's simply no other way to conduct stabilization than the way we're doing it. I think as much as the state would like to take the lead, equally defense would like to take the supporting role. But our resources are simply not structured that way. And until we take a good look at our federal budget and we figure out if it matters to us to really supply state and USAID and let them carry that burden, we're not going to make any changes, I don't think.
Question kind of related to that. Do you see progress being made in interagency cooperation and the use of USAID implementing partners to achieve good governance with our allies? And is this SAR working?
So, like I said, when I was at PKSOI, we were helping write the SAR. We were very excited about it. And then the same year, well, actually, November 2018, right? So the same year, the new defense strategy came out. And the main word in there was lethality. Our total focus is on lethality. It's no longer on stabilization. So I think that currently our total focus, again, is looking at near-peer competition, and that there is no interest in engaging in stabilization. Now, I do recall General Mattis saying that, okay, primary combat is over, ISIS is essentially defeated in Syria, now it's time for state and the contractors to come in and take care of what comes after. He was immediately contradicted by the president. So if you, even in the White House, you don't have a clear focus on this strategy, I don't know how it can, or an interest or an emphasis on the importance of stabilization. I think it's going to be remaining in the background in terms of effective planning, policymaking, resourcing, because the China and Russia are the big dogs in the room that are much more interesting this time.
So this is a very open-ended question tying into that, but do you see, or what do you see as the catalyst for the United States population to get behind programs that have a long-term output when we have a history of being in long-term conflicts and not really gaining a lot of things, and then also we're kind of stuck to a 24-hour news cycle and a 2-year election cycle. So what could be done to help maybe get the general population educated and then bring them on board as supportive of something like this?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think that's another key part of this, right? So the budget can't be the way it is without the American people's support. So I would say that individual Americans are very generous, very empathetic, and you see whenever we have some kind of natural disaster or the focus on helping folks that are really suffering from the current pandemic, people open their hearts, they open their wallets, they open their minds, and they want to be helpful. I think foreign policy has become something that is so removed from the American public's mindset. In our bubble here, it's all we talk about. But in the rest of the world, now that I've moved back to Erie, Pennsylvania, my hometown, where I love it, I have been told sharply by a bartender to stop talking about politics. Why would you stop talking about politics? Why would you stop talking about foreign policy? In the real America, people don't understand the complexity of foreign policy. They simply don't understand it. My brother's a dry cleaner. You know, my mom she works at his laundromat, and they're both very well read, so they think, but we'll talk about a foreign policy issue and they'll say, well, that's your opinion. I'm like, never mind 25 years of studying this stuff. It's not my opinion. So there's this lack of understanding of expertise that's growing in the country. And then there's just an apathy. People are way more concerned about what happens in their own backyard. And I think it's very difficult to get them interested. Remember the war in Bosnia. We were moved to action because of the pictures of Srebrenica. We can galvanize the American people in a moment for something horrific like that, but I don't know that we can provide long-term sustained interest for the kinds of really long-term, really granular sort of programming that's done like by USAID to maintain their interest and desire to continue. I would like it to be otherwise, because it's my primary interest.
So you talked about China and Russia. We know that they have a long-term approach, but the long-term approach is not necessarily for the benefit of the people they're working with, or countries to work with. Do you see any of our allied countries that are doing this effectively currently?
Doing stabilization operations?
Yes, and with a long-term approach.
The long-term approach. Well, I fear that China's going to get really good at it. That's what the Belt and Road Initiative is all about, right? So we should be concerned that we're in the process of, until of course the virus made us need it, we were in the process of decommissioning the Comfort and the Mercy, right? Those were huge parts of our power projection that were non-lethal. And just as we announced that we were decommissioning them a year or so ago, China announced that they were launching theirs. So I think that they're going to learn well from us how to use their largesse and their resources in smart power ways, while doing things that, like, they have a lot of young men they need to export. So when Huawei and these other countries go and sell their products overseas, they automatically come with technicians that stay for good. So they actually stay and they get to know the local people and the local conditions. So they're more able to identify where the needs are for Chinese resources. In addition to that, China has just announced that they want to offer, well, about a year ago, about 6,000 peacekeepers to the UN. So they're really getting involved in all the places where we are in the process of pulling back. I think that Russia is better at destabilization, but I think China is really learning the lesson of the importance of that smart power and the stabilization operations and the activities that go along with it that really can give it a lot of strength.
Well, Diane, this has been a great discussion. I am actually one that would sit in the bar with you and talk for hours about this.
Yes.
I love talking about it. I'm going to kind of wrap up here and see if we've got one final question, and then I'm going to let you any final comments you have. Well, it's not a question, it's a comment here, just from Ralph. Spot on regarding China. We at CSI are seeing this all through China. They are digging in and not hindered by party politics. So with that, just whatever final comments you have, you'd like to leave everybody with.
I missed what organization that last comment came from.
CSI.
Oh, CSI. Okay, very good. Thank you so much. No, I appreciate that. I'm no expert in China, but what I see is that they're really understanding all of this. So what I found really interesting in last week's discussion was this idea that the problem is we don't know what we don't know. We don't understand these populations. The thing that we are most afraid of, our military is most afraid of, General Odierno developed a special group to do research on once megacities, now dense urban environments. We understand the dangers. We understand that conflict comes only where there are people. And when you have people jammed together and they're very much in a situation where you have inequality and you have a lot of need, you're going to have conflict. And this is where we're going to be ending up. Again, for humanitarian assistance, for shoring up fragile states, or for combat. And our fear of those dense urban environments has paralyzed us from learning about them. I believe that there are probably only a dozen truly dense urban environments where we could do some old-fashioned intelligence work, some geopolitics, and look and figure out where are we likely to be engaging. We're not going to be fighting in Beijing or in Moscow. It's just not going to happen. So we don't need to worry about what's going on there because it's their problem. We're going to be in Lagos. We're going to be maybe in Rio. We're going to be in some of these places that we can identify. And why can't we have strategic intelligence, not what military intelligence has become, the high-value target machine that's self-feeding, but old-fashioned geopolitical strategic intelligence, training together, working together, putting the detectives and the librarians together with civil affairs, as last week's speaker said, and building really useful products so we can understand the local environment before we have to engage with it.
Awesome wrap up. Everybody that's attending, thank you for your attendance for this discussion. This video has been what's being recorded and will be available for sharing with your colleagues, other colleagues who did not make it, or to review again yourself. Again, Diane, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights. It's been a really great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for taking your time out today.
All right, have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, bye-bye.